Okay, welcome to the first first exposition in a line of many, hopefully. A series of videos that are centered around the exposition and the discussion of pictures of Christ in the Bible, from the Old Testament, from Genesis to Revelation, to the end of the Bible, and how each story points to Christ. So we're beginning with the story of the Exodus because the story of the Exodus and the book of Exodus itself is a clear and definite picture of the soul of the person who was lost and then finds Christ, becomes saved. Because the story of the Exodus, specifically of the Israelites leaving the land of Egypt, focuses on salvation. That's its theme, is salvation and who brings salvation and how to attain salvation. So we begin in Exodus 1, and before we start, we have to realize, and you have to remember constantly when you read this book, like the Bible, that every story in this book, every word, every phrase, every sentence written down and uttered has some relation, some meaning, some picture of Christ. That is this book's divine purpose, is to point the individual who reads it to Jesus, whether it's the story of creation or the story of Jonah or the story of Moses or the story of Ruth. It doesn't matter. It points to Christ in some way. And of course, the Exodus is no exception. So we begin in Exodus chapter 1, and we start by reading, and we read the first couple of verses, and we find that Joseph and his brothers, Joseph being one of the rulers of Egypt, who was an Israelite, and his brothers, they emigrate to Egypt, and it says that Joseph's brothers become numerous in number. So they move from their home and they come to Egypt because of a great famine, and because the land is fertile in Egypt, and the brothers become very prosperous, and so do their families. They become great in number, and they're rich, and for all intensive purposes, it's like they're living in perfection. It's like their life is perfect. And of course, it isn't, because they're human and they're sinners, but we don't read of any wars. We don't read of any trials or tribulations that the brothers are required to go through. So for all intensive purposes, their life is perfect. And this goes on for some time. Joseph and his brothers and their families, they die, but the Israelite community and culture continues to grow larger and larger, until eventually one day it says in verse 8 that a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, to who Joseph was not regarded, rises up. So a Pharaoh comes to power in Egypt, rises up, and the name of Joseph and what Joseph did for the Egyptians, which was save them from famine, it meant nothing to him. And this Pharaoh realizes that if the Israelites become too powerful, the Egyptians could be overthrown and their empire would be lost, and so on. And so the Pharaoh decides to take the Israelites captive, to make them slaves. And so he does so. He tells the people in Egypt, he says, look, nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to this people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. We must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we will lose, basically. So he oppresses the Israelites. He takes them under slavery. He becomes their ruler, and the Israelites are subject to harsh labor. So what does this all mean? Because I said that this all points to a picture of Christ and the human condition. Evidently it does. So we begin by the brothers. And it's like I said, they were living, in all intensive purposes, they were living in perfection, and their families were living peacefully in perfection. And this is a picture of creation, because when God created Adam and Eve, He creates them perfect. They are without sin. They are righteous. That is to say, they're pure. They are innocent. They know not sin. They don't know pain or suffering or death. All they know is perfection. And for a time, as we know, they lived in the Garden of Eden, and they literally walked with God every day, and life was perfect. And then, of course, we know that one day Satan comes in and tempts them. So Adam and Eve were living perfectly. They were living without sin, and we can define sin as Ravi Zacharias puts it. Sin is the violation of God's being. I think that's a great definition. Sin is the violation of God's being. So they had never violated God's being. That is to say, they weren't separate from God. And so this is like the brothers. The brothers are living in perfection with their families, and Adam and Eve are living in perfection. Nothing is wrong. Of course, the brothers had sinned. They were sinners, but for our purposes, they were perfect. And so this goes on for some time. And then, of course, we know in creation, eventually Satan comes in. Satan takes the form of a serpent and tempts Eve and Adam. And so this, of course, is a picture with Pharaoh. So it says, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. This Pharaoh is the archetype of Satan in this entire story. Pharaoh is a perfect picture of Satan. He has a vehement hatred for the Israelites, and he is a concise and clear picture of the devil. And so, of course, the devil being the adversary and the accuser, the anti of God, but never the equal, right? He's the adversary of God, but he's not his equal. And indeed, he's a slave. Satan himself is a slave, as Job 41 says. Regardless, that's who Pharaoh is. Pharaoh is a picture of Satan. And so Satan tempts, as we know, Eve and Adam and Eve. And of course, when Eve eats the fruit, even though God told them not to, then Adam eats the fruit, they sin. That is to say, they disobey God. And of course, the sin wasn't the fruit itself; it was the heart. But anyways, so Adam and Eve commit sin, and in an instant, they become slaves. They fall. And what I mean by that is they become slaves to sin, because Jesus says in John 8:31-36 that everyone who sins is a slave to sin. That's the reality of our nature. So in an instant, after Satan tempts Adam and Eve, after they commit the sin, they become slaves. And all it takes is an instant for them to fall. And that's seen quickly because Adam blames God for giving him Eve, for making him sin, and so on. It's an instant transition into utter darkness and evil. And Romans 6:1-12 says this too, that we are slaves to sin in our natural state. And so this is exemplified with the Israelites. So the Israelites were living in perfection, then this new king comes to power. This new king being a picture of Satan, Pharaoh being a picture of Satan, the Israelites then being a picture of first of all Adam and Eve, and then everyone in the world, everyone who's ever existed. So they were living in perfection. Pharaoh comes to power, and he oppresses the Israelites. The Israelites become slaves, just like how when we're born, instantly we're slaves to sin. Everyone who's ever existed, everyone who will exist other than Christ is a sinner. There is no exception to this rule. There is no outlier. Every person who has ever lived is a sinner, from the highest of kings to the lowest of beggars. Everybody is a sinner. That's the reality of our nature. So that is to say, the moment we're born, we're beings of pure evil. So the concept of a good person is an irrational one. It's illogical. There is no such thing in our natural state as a good person, because we are beings of pure evil, and we're slaves in this empire. It's like it's as though both of our parents were born in a prison, or lived in a prison, and then we were born inside the prison as well. So the moment we're born, we're in the prison. It's the moment we're born, we're sinners. And so we see that now the Israelites are slaves, just as we are slaves to sin in our natural state. And so what happens then? So it says in verse 11 that Pharaoh puts slave masters over the Israelites and makes them work with forced labor, and they built all these great store cities, and it says that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread. And then it continues to go that the more they were oppressed, the harder they worked. They worked them ruthlessly, it says. So the more they did, the more they are worked. And this is a picture of us living by the law. So perhaps some person realizes that he or she is a sinner, and in an attempt to have peace with God, or to get right with God, they attempt to live a good life. And we define this as living by the law. And the law is just a set of rules and commands given to us by God, which which demonstrate attributes that are fundamental to his nature. So particularly with the Ten Commandments, we read that every action, every command given in the Ten Commandments is intended to bring life, or intended to keep life. That's its purpose. So don't murder, right? You want to keep life. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Meaning, don't commit atrocities in God's name. Right? The purpose in every command is for the continuation or the creation of life, because God is a bringer of life. And so people try to live by this law. They try to keep this law to become good. And what happens is you do the opposite. This is what Romans 7 says. And this is a topic for another time. But if you try not to lie, your body goes, I must lie, because our nature is sin. Our nature is to do the opposite. And so apart from the law that God gives, Paul says sin is dead. So if I didn't have this law, I wouldn't know what sin was. But because we do, and because I know what sin is, my body forces me to sin. And so the harder I try not to sin, that is to say, like the Israelites, the harder I work, the harder I try not to sin, the more I'm oppressed. And so the harder I try not to do what is wrong, the more the empire or the emperor of evil, we can call him Satan or Pharaoh, oppresses us. The more that I am put under the law, the more I feel the condemnation of my actions. It's just like the Jews in Auschwitz, we can think, because no matter how hard the Jews worked, no matter how much they did for their Germans, for the Nazis, they couldn't get out of Auschwitz. The Nazis kept them there. It was their labor camp, and no matter what the Jews did, they couldn't be free, not on their own. So, what it required was what is required is an outside force, something that comes from outside the system, but is one of us. So we need a Savior who is one of us, who is the same as us, but is from outside the system. That is how the means of salvation are provided. And so for the Israelites in this instance, it's Moses, but for us, of course, and for the entire world, it's Christ. That's who our Savior is, and that we'll discuss in the next video.